Good morning. Steve Miller and I are going to speak actually very briefly. Our talk will probably be 15 or minutes or so. We'll talk about Subpart CC, cranes and derricks used in construction. We'll talk a little bit about how we got where we are today. If you're looking for a lot of insight on where we are today with the standard, good luck, because there's a lot of balls in the air right now. Joel Olivia with CCO is going to talk some about that as well at the latter part of our presentation. But the standard went into effect November of 2010. It was a standard that was developed starting back as long as like 2003, 2004. We met in Washington, D.C. I represented the Steel Erectors Association. Doug Williams, who's also with Buckner, was on the committee representing SC&RA. There was 21 or 22 other members on there from industry, from manufacturers, from insurance companies. And we met for a year and came up with the draft standard. The government sat on it for 4 years. I was thinking 5, but a lot of bureaucracy went into it. There was actually some changes. 17 very significant changes were made by OSHA after we reached an agreement on the standard, and so there was some changes that went in. But I think first to go back into the standard and talk about why it is we needed a new crane and derrick standard. And this is accident data that runs from 1992 to 2006, and it's crane-related deaths in the construction industry from 92 to 2006. And you can see, the average is up in the neighborhood of 20 plus people die in the United States in crane-related construction accidents every year. And there was the data that you just saw was 632 crane-related construction worker deaths, 611 different accidents. 17 of those accidents resulted in multiple deaths. And I know that everybody in the room, all the members that employ operators and iron workers, everybody in this room believes that our workers, the one thing that they have the right to do is to go home at the end of the day, just having worked safely. And to lose that many folks in that window of time due to crane accidents is really unacceptable. So the industry kind of banded together to bring the standard up to speed with the technology that we've seen since OSHA went into effect in 1970. Don't necessarily need to agree with it all. Everything that's in the standard and some of the tweaks that OSHA has done. I'm not saying that we necessarily got everything we wanted, but much like the CENRAC standard, the crane and derrick standard is a negotiated rule. And we all fought hard for little pieces that we wanted in the standard, but in the end, nobody got everything they wanted. In fact, there was a lot of opposition to crane operator certification from a couple of groups that were on the committee. But in the end, the standard does include operator certification. One of the things that kind of pushed the standard, I think that with the Democrats winning the White House in 2008, that the standard was going to come out. It was kind of held back actually by the Bush administration, because there was opposition out of Texas to the whole thought of operator certification and how we deal with Spanish-speaking crane operator candidates and testing and those kind of things. And so there was that opposition, but in the end it's in there and it goes into effect in 2014. One of the other things that drove it to make sure that it did go into effect, if you remember, 2008 was a particularly bloody year in the crane industry and the construction industry. And 3 ENR covers here started in March of 2008 with the tower crane that went over in New York City. And then a few months later, they're doing a front cover called Rigor Mortis. By this time, the initial incident investigation into the accident in New York City is out, and we find out that the accident was caused by a strap that broke while they were jumping the tower crane, a nylon strap. And then later in the year, actually a week after the Rigor Mortis cover comes out, there's another tower crane that goes over in New York City and kills the operator, and a couple more. There was some tragic accidents down in Miami-Dade County, and it went on, and it seemed like if we were in the construction industry and cranes, you know, it's like you get phone calls. I know some of the other erectors in the room have gotten them. You'll get a call from a neighbor. Was that your crane that went over in New York City? You know, was that your crane that went over here? And it's a black eye on all of us in the construction industry. But anyway, in 2008, after some of the accidents, there was a lot of political pressure to get the standard into effect, and it is now. These are some, there's a whole lot of data on one slide to read, but basically, with a search, I could only find a couple different citations that have been written from a federal standpoint since the implementation of the standard. And Steve Miller and I had some lively discussion about this particular case last night, and not knowing a lot about it, but you have a company that was using a Broderson. It appears the Broderson might have tipped over. When it did, it got into the power lines and somebody was electrocuted. I don't think it was a fatal accident, but it was ironic to me that after this accident, they cited nothing out of the subpart CC having to do with electrical lines. They cited them for not working on stable ground and not having daily and monthly inspections. It had nothing to do with working in proximity to power lines. Maybe that was reasonable for the accident, I don't know. But my point of it is I'm not even sure some of the compliance officers out there right now know exactly how to enforce this new standard, because since 2010, there's only been these two incidents that show up on the OSHA website as being citations out there alleging violations of the standard. And this is the second one. The more bad news, this is an article that came out last week in the National Safety Council newsletter that I get, but OSHA got an increase of $7 million in their coming year's budget. So if we haven't had enough enforcement activity on the new standard, I think you'll see more enforcement on it next year. That's coupled with the fact that by the end of this year, federal OSHA is saying that they will have a compliance directive out on telling their compliance officers how to enforce this standard. One of the things about the standard that they don't understand, the compliance officers, when you read the preamble and you read the standard as well, we're talking about a document to really truly understand it is over 1,000 pages when you have the preamble in there. And you have to go to the preamble in some cases to really understand what the intent of the CDAC committee was for the reason that some of the things are in the standard. But one of the things where we're at in this timeline up here as far as how the standard came to be is the only timeline left to hit is November 8th, 2014, which is when operator certification will become mandatory in the United States. And there are several different programs out there for crane operator certification. Joel Olivia with CCO is going to join us up here in just a minute. But here today you have literally, as far as I know, all but one of the certifying bodies. Crane Institute is here, NCCER is here with the North American Crane Bureau, as well as CCO. CCO's been in the game a long time. They were one of the beginning certifying bodies, probably the most recognized in the industry by a lot of folks, but certainly not the only one. So I just want to say that. There's a lot to the standard. I'm going to run through the highlights real quick and then hand off to Steve here. But we've got, as I said a few minutes ago, there's 1,075 pages, including the preamble. So it's a pretty voluminous document. There are a number of things, and I'm going to let Steve talk about it, but issues I would call them. Forklift. If you put a hook on a forklift, the standard says that may be a crane. And there's some issues like that I'm going to ask Steve to address, some thoughts about whether it is or isn't, and then I'll let you introduce Joel.
All right, thanks. So on this forklift issue, a guy by the name of Dean McKenzie with Fed OSHA come out to Denver and did a talk, and there's some language in there, the interpretation between what these fellows meant when they wrote the standard and what OSHA interpreted it to mean is there's a pretty good sized gap in there. It come down to hair-splitting details such as if I've got a choker and a hook hanging off of a forklift mast, then because I'm hoisting by means of a winch and or hook, this thing becomes a crane. That certainly wasn't the intent of the committee, and one of the people in the crowd asked Mr. McKenzie, well, what if we took the hook off and used a shackle and a choker instead of the hook? Would it still then meet the requirements of the standard? And he obviously didn't have an answer to that, but the technical answer, if they want to look at it from a technical point of view, is no. Now it's not covered. But our frustration is that the forklift standard is a lot more comprehensive than the crane standard was, and it's been around for many years, and it addresses all the same hazards. So to try to duplicate that and bring it into the crane standard doesn't make a lot of sense. There's not a crane test for a forklift. So if this thing fell under the standard, how would you test this operator? There's not a designated test for that. So lots of that kind of confusion. And we're going to talk a little bit, too, about what we're seeing in the industry and from a compliance point of view out in Region 8 in Colorado, in the 8 western states around Colorado. OSHA's telling us that we've not been trained, we don't understand this standard, and we're not going to go out there and look like a bunch of fools, and so we're not going to enforce the standard until somebody comes and trains us. And we had an opportunity to train all the compliance officers in Colorado 8 or 10 years ago, and it went really well, because what we want, and I'm sure Frank will talk to this issue as well later, but we want well-educated OSHA compliance officers. We want them to know what they're talking about and what they're looking at so we can uniformly enforce this standard. So we're looking forward to that day where they do get some training, and Chip and I and some others hope that we can be involved in that process. From the deadline point of view, we've been doing more CCO crane operator training and testing than ever before, and what we're seeing coming through our doors now is that most of the experienced crane operators that do this for a living have already gone through the process and they've got their certification. Most of them are up for their recerts already. But what we're seeing is in a large majority from the energy industries of these guys coming in that are part-time crane operators. They run a little boom truck to unload parts and manifolds and this and that. They're doing limited amounts of work, but they're not proficient crane operators. So we see lots of difficulty from a point of view of, well, we can train you in a workshop to pass the written exams and give you the technical information, but when it comes time to go out and do a practical and actually get on the crane and run it, they're experiencing a very high degree of difficulty, and especially boom trucks, because physically that's the hardest test to do. So we're working on that. We're doing some different things, and CCO is expanding some of their criteria for the practical exams, and Joel, I'm sure, will talk about including some pre-start inspections and shutdown operations and that kind of thing under a test basis. So limited enforcement, that's what we're seeing in Colorado and in other parts of the country that we work. For instance, I got a call one day from one of my clients, and OSHA was on the site. He was going to cite them because they were setting pipe in a ditch with a backhoe. And specifically, that's listed in the exclusions under the standard that doesn't fall under the standard. And so it really took no more than a few seconds on the phone with the compliance officer and enlightening him, and then he was off the site. But we're seeing the limited amount of enforcement they are attempting to do is usually wrong. So, so pay attention to that and don't just roll over on citations. But the easy things, that's what we're seeing, inspections and logs and monthly inspections. And a lot of our training this year has been geared towards inspections. So there's a lot more comprehensive language in the new standard regarding inspections. There's some new types of inspections. People are becoming aware of that. That's a good thing. We think that's all positive. So that's about it for now. We're going to do some questions and answers at the end of this thing. And Joel's here with NCCCO. They've got some exciting news and changes of things that are coming down the pike. And so without further ado, Joel.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks, Chip. I'm Joel Oliva, Program Manager of Test Development with the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, NCCCO. Thanks for the invitation to be here. And I'll keep my comments brief. Chip and Steve, I think, covered it generally well. I've certainly open to some Q&A, as I'm sure there's a lot of questions in the room. I'll just mention a few things that we've been doing on the certification side. Certainly everybody in this room is affected by this rule and the way you do work, but so were we as a certification body. For the first time ever, we saw standards that actually told us how to do our work, had pretty specific requirements about what the certification involved, how you test candidates, what needs to be on the exam, how often you test them, which was pretty unprecedented. For the most part, the ASME standards have always said the qualification standards are there. Even some states required certification, but that's as far as they went. They said accredited certification, which we've held, but they never told us how to do things. And now, us, along with the other certification bodies, are faced with those challenges. We're working on making those adjustments. We've made some changes to meet the standards. Steve alluded to the practical exam. One of the requirements of the standard is that the practical exam include a pre-inspection checklist as well as the safe shutdown procedures. Those of you that are familiar with the CCO exam, we've always tested that on the written exam. And in the B30 committee, they've actually said you can test it on either the written or the practical. That's now changed. If you read the language, law of the land, and as we've been told by OSHA, you've got to interpret it by black and white. That now has to be addressed from a practical standpoint. So we're currently doing some pilot testing on adding that element to the practical exam. For a lot of reasons, we'd actually prefer not to do it. It adds, Steve will tell you, as a practical examiner, adds a lot of extra time to the examination. In our opinion, based on our subject matter experts and job task analysis, it does not add a lot of value to the exam. But sometimes you got to do things because you're told to do things, not because you want to do things. But we're looking at some potential solutions, maybe coming up with a modification to a practical, adding it to the written exam. The other big news, which I know is near and dear to Chip's heart, I couldn't not mention it here. As of February of this year, CCO exams will now allow calculators to be used on the specialty exams for the load charts. I know that's been a long-standing issue for a long time. Come July of this year, we actually did a pretty extensive study to ensure that that the change was appropriate. Years ago, when we opted to not go with calculators, that was based on industry insight and support. But we wanted to take a careful look at it. We set up the study, did a careful analysis, and determined that in reality, you've got to still be able to do the math questions. There are going to be some arithmetic questions on the core where you will not have a calculator. But then on the load chart exams, you will have a calculator. That's a very common part of what a crane operator has available to him, and now we'll make that we'll have that available for candidates. A CCO supplied calculator, mind you, won't be able to bring in your own thing. That's a security issue, but that'll start in July. So that's just, I guess, a glance into some of the changes. There's some other things we're looking at: the content of the exams, the number of exams. We're developing brand new programs. Steve mentioned the forklifts. The digger derrick industry, which is used mainly in the utility world, and now the mechanics truck industry have both approached us and said, hey, we're now going to be covered, although not entirely, but partly covered by this rule. So we're just about wrapping up our digger derrick program. and we're just getting into our mechanics truck or service truck program as well. So there'll be some changes, some growing pains for CCO, but at the end of the day, we want to be able to have the programs for the industry to be able to meet the OSHA standards. So I'll leave it there. Again, we have a booth here, a small plug for us. So if you have any questions about the CCO program, if you have certified operators, please come on by. I'd be happy to answer those questions for you. But I'll end it there, and I guess we can open it up for questions. Yes, Doug, go ahead. We're going to make Chip a nice big calculator. Yes.
I have a question for Chip. What is the weight of the preamble as far as interpreting the statute? In other words, does it have any teeth about which they can use to cite something? Because I know that OSHA behind closed doors, after the CDAC committee got through with it, changed some things that were not in alliance with the CDAC.
I think the biggest thing, Cliff, was as a committee, and Doug will tell you, we had a conference call, like, I think it was July or August, they called and said, finally, after 4 years, we're going to roll this thing out. We're going to kick it out the door. We're done having our way with it. But we want to send you guys that were on the CDAC committee an advance notice of these 17 changes that we made. 17, but there were 17, but only 10 of them, 12 of them were really significant. The other one was just tweaking, is the way they kind of sold it. And so we all got an email from the director that had these changes that they had put into the standard. And those, thank you, those, I think the majority of us on the committee and from the industry looked at them and said, you know, we could fight it now. We could just jump up and raise Cain and file a legal suit and really stop the standard. But if you do that, do you end up with, I mean, how long is it going to be before we get another standard that brought the crane industry safety standards, you know, up to current where they should be? If there's any indication of what they did, it would have been years, you know, more years, 5 years, 10 years, who knows? So I think the committee and the industry decided to not fight it, let them have their way with it, even though those changes are out there. And we're just going to have to work through it through case law, I think. I mean, through citations, and that's unfortunate, but I think that's where it's going to go. But I think the preamble is going to become vitally important in defense of some citations as we go down the road, because people like Frank Coleman are going to make their living being able to dive into the preamble and come up with what was the intent when the standard was written. What hazard was it intended to solve? And I think that's why the preamble will become important. And I hope that answered your question.
Let me add just a little bit to that. Dean McKenzie, when he did this talk a few weeks ago down in Austin, Texas for AGC, was expressing his extreme frustration because there's three parts. There's the preamble, there's the standard, and then there's the vehicle of interpretation letters as a last resort. And he was saying how angry he was because the current generation of compliance people use letters of interpretation to enforce the law, and that's contrary to the way it's supposed to be, and because it's easy for them. And it's really basically, we're taking the opinion that gossip is stronger than the written word is essentially what they're doing. And so it's extremely important to read the preamble and understand it because of what Chip said, to understand why does this sentence, why is it worded this way? What does this really mean? And you can't get that until you read the preamble. And it's an investment in time, but it's worth it. And then the standard is the foundation for enforcement rather than the Directorate of Construction, depending on what administration's in there right now and what their opinion is, they issue these letters of interpretation based on their opinions. Well, that's not law. And he was saying we need to get away from that, and we need to disallow that.
But is the preamble law?
The preamble is the declaration of the law. The standard itself is the codification of that language, is the written law. But the preamble has the full weight of the law. That's what a judge would go to make a decision.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Frank Coleman.
Yeah. Am I saying something wrong, Frank?
The preamble is persuasive interpretation on what the regulation means, which means the judge or OSHA could use it to their benefit or not. I hate to be cynical, but every time you have to go to another document to interpret what another document means, there's plenty of opportunity for lawyers on both sides to play games.
Maybe.
Means good luck.
Any other questions? I'm sorry, Pete? Yeah, we can.
Assembly and disassembly is typical last spring. Does that require third-party inspection each time?
No.
That's what you see out
It- What Pete was asking is just typical assembly, disassembly of a lattice boom crane. You move a crane in on a job site, you're going to assemble it, put it together. You have an assembly, disassembly supervisor that works for you. He puts it together. He inspects it, makes sure all the pins are in, the Carter keys are in the right places, ropes are reeved over the drum, all that's done. There is no requirement in the standard for a third party. There is a requirement for a post-assembly inspection, but the intent of that was just what I just said. You put the crane together, and then somebody who is competent walks down through there to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be.
where I see it getting it out of the standard. I'm trying to convince them there is a part in there. If you do major work on that crane, you pull the voice drum off of it, you index the turntable, then yes, you have to do this inspection. But every GC item, not that a GC item there yet, it does say you got to have a third party inspection. I argued with one the other day with Perkins, well, you don't have to do it with a tiger truck. I said, so you mean to tell me if I run 550 ton linear out here, boom comes out separate. Okay? You got far more truckloads than this little last 40-ton crane test. And all the counterweights come out loose, all the outriggers come loose, I don't have to inspect it.
When we do post-assembly inspections for Mortensen on like a 500-ton Liebherr, literally they hire us to come out and look at the lattice part of the boom, and that's it.
He's talking about a big hydro 500 ton.
No, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But to me, the intent would be that guy that's putting that 500-ton Liebherr would be in the same boat as you. I mean, you should be under no more than he is. What happens is, and it happens with any standard, when you get into the general contractor's construction management world, they think, well, this is the OSHA standard, and it's a minimum standard, and we somehow need to make you safer. And they think they got to protect us from ourselves sometimes, I believe. But those Turner, Bovis, those requirements are probably not going to go away. You know, it's.
That's right. Well, all the standard says literally is that it has to be done by a qualified person.
They seem to have a big problem with it.
Right.
I'm looking for some sort of expert out there that I can pull from this standard and
Go to the preamble.
Any other questions?